welcome to the Business Chat podcast. Daniel Murray, it's great to have you here today.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be able to speak with you.
Yeah, looking forward to diving into the topic of empathy. It's one that fascinates me and something that I bring to my work as a communication skills consultant. And it is definitely an area that is in need, even more so today. And I'm looking forward to chatting with you and hearing your insights around how you help leaders and teams and organizations to really embrace and to develop their empathy. It's definitely one of those super skills. It's one of those skills that we've got to keep on working at in order to be effective. So let's start off by talking about why empathy is currently in short supply in organizations.
Look, I think it's a great sort of place to start. I think there's a few different reasons that are driving this, and it'll be different for everyone and their situation. Often, what I find is the typical organization is far more complex now than it's ever been. So there's a lot of different skill sets and types of work that are going on. If I think to banking 20 years ago, they wouldn't have had as many sort of designers, software engineers, data analysts, or data scientists even floating around the hallways. And so as this complexity grows and as the number of different people and skills increases, it's natural for those people not to see the world the same way. And therefore, the importance of having empathy, and the reason why it's in shorter supply, I guess, is we're having to try and deal with all of this complexity. We've got a lot of things going on in our area. Therefore, we can become quite sort of narrow in our focus and what we're trying to do, which we don't notice it straight away, but it actually pushes us, or we drift apart from other people. The other big driver, I guess, is that we live in an economy where you can work with someone in India in the morning, in the UK in the afternoon. You can work with people who are from vastly different areas, backgrounds to yourself, really, really commonly. That's a relatively recent human phenomenon. If you think about 10,000 years of human history, where you were born, you'd probably, for most of the time, lived within a pretty close radius of that area, and people who came from far away were really rare. That's a totally different situation to today, where I can guess from your accent you weren't born in where you live today, and everyone has this movement, which is great. But again, that tests us a little bit because we have to try and understand and empathize with people who are very different from us.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely a fascinating topic, and there's so many different facets to it. And one thing that I commonly find is, well, being empathetic and showing empathy, it takes time. And often leaders are super busy and they've got deadlines, and you can't do it properly if you're in a rush. It's about stopping and thinking. It's about having insights in how your communication is going to land with the other person, and the whether it's an excuse or not. But often, what I hear is, we push for time. We've got to get this message out. We've got to have this conversation. We've got to give the feedback. We've got to do whatever it is, and so having that empathy lens requires patience and it requires time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd probably build on that and say, your brain is naturally going to look for assumptions to guide it through the world, and those assumptions generally work pretty well. When we're feeling busy, stressed, tired, our brain tends to use them more often. So we'll see something and we'll make an assumption about what it means. And this is something that I use a little example here, Lisa, that you might relate to. Let's imagine in the ancient history, thousands of years ago, there were two gentlemen walking through a forest. Now, one of them was your traditional human who made assumptions, was very reactive and responsive to the environment around them. And the other was very curious, open, thoughtful, considerate. There's a rustling in the bushes on the path up ahead of them. The first person makes an assumption that it could be a tiger and runs, reacts, just makes an assumption and runs away. The second person thinks, well, it might not be. It could be anything. I'm going to go and check it out. And which of those two people do you think would have lived longer, survived in those environments, and passed on their DNA, their genetic material? There's a good chance our ancestor was the former. So this is where we need to understand that our brains have a default towards making assumptions.
Yeah.
And when we see someone do something, your brain wants to fill in the why they did it.
Yeah.
And you do that based on your assumptions, not based on their assumptions or their understanding. So that's where empathy helps us bridge that gap.
Fascinating. Yeah, so we're constantly fighting our hard wiring, aren't we? I mean, our brain's primary purpose is to keep us safe and to protect us from danger. And when we're getting these signals, we got to fight really hard not to go to the default. Yes, it definitely takes time and patience.
And what we know is that under certain conditions like stress and the different parts of our nervous system and brain start to activate. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the brilliant work of Daniel Kahneman, but he talks a lot about this idea that in your brain are two systems. One is fast and responsive and not particularly sophisticated in its decision making, but it doesn't use much power.
Yeah.
The other is highly complex, very thoughtful and logical, but once you activate that part of your brain, you shut down everything else. You can't concentrate on more than one thing, and it takes up a lot of energy. So our brain naturally defaults towards the simple, the easy, the reactive parts of our brain. And again, I'm in a meeting, lots of people are talking. I notice someone speaks a bit louder than everyone else. For me, that feels like they're being aggressive. I make the assumption they're being aggressive. And then I react and respond in that same, with that basis as my response mechanism. So whereas I could say, well, hang on, that's interesting. Wonder why they're doing that. Why are they passionate? Are they being aggressive? Is it just the way they talk? Empathy is trying to explore what's really going on before I use that assumption. Easy to do in hindsight, but hard to do sometimes when we've got deadlines, we've got things we've got to work on.
That's a great example and one I can relate to. I often speak loud because I've got a considerable hearing impairment. So for me, it's just what I do. But you're so right there, and I think that your insights so far have been incredibly helpful, because there may be people listening who think that their ability to not have empathy or not demonstrate empathy means there might be something wrong with them, but it's natural for us not to. This is something we've got to learn to do. So I think that's really useful as a starting point. So thank you so much, Daniel, for sharing that to kick off.
I'll probably just build on something you said there, because and this is a bit of an admission, maybe, Lisa. My degree in mathematics is my first degree, and I spent a lot of time doing that. And I don't always tell people that because it's they stop talking to me sometimes. But the basis for me of getting into this area was that I didn't feel like I was naturally that empathetic.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. Some people feel like, well, I'm just not empathetic, or that's just not me, or you're born with it, or some other excuse that we give ourselves. But the reality is we're just wired differently. We think differently. And when we misinterpret the way empathy can be used, it can be dangerous. So some people think empathy is feeling what someone else feels. And that definitionally is a type of empathy, but it's not always that useful. If someone is desperately sad and depressed, and then you feel desperately sad and depressed, that might not be helpful.
Yeah.
Whereas the empathy I want to work on with, or I want to encourage leaders to think about is, why are they feeling like that? Not from my perspective, from their perspective, what's going on for them? Because if I want to help or support, that's the starting point from my understanding.
Yeah. And sometimes those words may be used interchangeable. You know, we hear sympathy and empathy. What about compassion? What's the difference between compassion and empathy?
Look, the way I tend to think about it, and this is obviously complex, and
Mm,
the definitions are both important and
mm,
confusing at times. Compassion is where you take action to help someone.
right.
And now,
Mm,
whether that is, if that is compassion or action based on sympathy,
mm,
then is a good chance your actions, you're actually doing them to make yourself feel better, not to help the other person. Whereas if you're taking action based on that, or from that basis of empathy, I really want to understand what's going on for this person, and then I'm going to take action. That's where I feel like we need to focus when we think about compassion.
yeah.
Um, there, if I see someone, a homeless person sitting in the street, and I feel bad about it, so I throw
Mm,
them $2,
mm,
that's not really for them. That was for me. I'm trying to make myself feel better. And I didn't take any time to understand that person's situation, what's going on, what they actually need.
mm,
This is
mm.
why empathy is much harder, and being more compassionate is much, much more difficult than those usual pieces of reaction that we have.
Yeah, yeah. And when you've got that added complexity of different people with different lens and view of the world, when we're trying to be empathetic, we are trying to understand how they might be feeling or receiving our message or our feedback, whatever it is, but we don't know until we know what their view of the world is. So it is really multi-layered, isn't it?
It is, and like if we think of this in a business context, imagine, you're sitting around a boardroom table with your peers, for example, an executive leadership team, and someone across the table, let's call them Sam, they say they want more resources. Now, what I see happen quite often is individuals will make an assumption of why they want those resources, what's going on. One person thinks, well, Sam's putting in a power play here. They're trying to,
Yeah.
gather up all these resources. Another person might think they'll be just wasted there. And we all start with these very different opinions. And at some point, we think we're having one conversation. But if you took all of those storylines that are running in every
Yeah.
individual's heads and put them together, they wouldn't make any sense. There'd be 4 or 5 different stories and narratives being rolled out here. And so empathy in a business context is, as a leader, being able to identify what's going on, what's really happening for each of these people, and how can we use that understanding to build a shared narrative to make sure we're all on the same page. What's that
Mm.
one sort of truth that we want to really unpack and unlock here? Now, it takes time, because
Yeah.
I have to ask the question. So, what's going on? Why do you need those resources, Sam? And
Mm.
uh, they have to give an honest and open answer, and we have to build trust. So, there's a lot of pieces that need to be in place. But
Yeah.
so often, we don't even take that first step. We make the
Yeah.
assumption and we move on.
So when we're learning to communicate better and to express our emotions and our needs in a clear way, with that example that you just shared about Sam, Daniel, do you think that it also would be useful rather than have the people around the table kind of guessing and coming up with their own assumptions and view, if Sam had articulated a little bit more in that context of I need more resources?
Absolutely. But we come back to a similar problem, which is if we don't invest in building shared
Yeah.
understanding early in the piece, one person could hear Sam talking and think, well, they're just going to take all, Sam's getting on the
Yeah.
soapbox again. They're going to take all this time up.
Yeah.
So it's not a moment to moment
Mm.
piece that we need to think about. It's not a tactical tool to deploy
Yeah.
in these specific areas. But what we do talk about a lot with leaders is what are the actions you can take to start building those relationships and building that understanding.
Yeah.
And again, really understanding what's going on for someone is
Mm.
vital. I mean, we all, again, just to probably highlight that we all make assumptions, and
Mm.
we use them quite readily. I'm just suggesting that, or I suspect that most people listening would have already determined whether Sam was a man or a woman.
Yeah.
Now,
Interesting.
I haven't used Sam's gender at all, but
Yeah.
your brain doesn't like having uncertainty, so it'll fill in the gaps and use the assumptions to move forward. So we need to be very thoughtful when
Yeah.
we are communicating, that we test those assumptions, we ask those questions, and we try and build that understanding. It may
Mm.
be irrelevant whether Sam is a man, woman, or other in this situation, but it is something that just
Yeah.
highlights that our brain does that automatically.
Yeah, yeah. So, how can we train empathy? It's one of those soft skills that is the soft skills are the hardest to learn, and yet I believe that your soft skills are your strongest skills. So, how do you go about training somebody in empathy?
So that I think when I think about these, there's a different word I'll use instead of soft skills. And I think soft skills is great because people
Mm,
know what we mean when we say it. But there's skills that support us in tangible work that we do. So this helps us with things like running budgets and
mm,
spreadsheets and processes and systems, all the stuff you can touch and measure. And then there's a set of skills we need to manage the intangible parts of our organization. So people, culture, values,
yeah.
relationships. You can't measure these, but you experience them and feel them.
Mm,
And so what we focus on a lot is how do we develop skills to play in that space more effectively?
yeah.
There's elements there of self-awareness. Um, when we think about empathy in particular, we use a process called the empathy process, which is 4 steps to help us build empathy. And I can talk through that pretty quickly if that would be useful. But the other piece that we use quite often is a perspective taking tool.
Hmm.
And this perspective taking tool really pushes people to drop those assumptions and try and actually develop, almost in a brainstorming way,
Yeah.
what might be driving someone who thinks something different to me.
Mm,
And it's a really powerful tool that we can put any point of view in the middle. We have fun sometimes in workshops. We'll put things in the middle, like why would people dance on TikTok and record themselves? Why do people believe the Earth is flat? Or why would you hoard toilet paper? But you can use it for
yeah.
pretty much any point of view that you
Yeah.
don't understand. Some of the more challenging in an emotional sense that we've gone through why would someone be a suicide bomber? What would
Mm,
drive that person to do that? And trying to really,
yeah.
again, drop our assumptions on what's driving them and get into the minds of someone else.
Yeah.
And so my belief is anything we want to improve in our lives, we have to have dedicated practice and focus and tools and strategies in which to practice and deploy those
Yeah.
skills. And so we really focus on what are the tools and what are the times and opportunities to practice those skills.
Yeah. And how important is coaching for leaders, one-on-one executive coaching to be able to really uncover their level of empathy and guide them towards being more
uh,
empathic?
I think there's one-on-one coaching is a pretty powerful tool, and what it allows is, in particular when I'm working with some of my clients in this space, is to have really challenging
Mm.
questions and
Yeah.
conversations and get into some pretty deep water about what's
Yeah.
going on and how do they work.
Mm.
And what I often find is if we augment that, if we take that one-to-one experience and then also work with a leadership team as
Yeah.
a group together, what you start to see is individuals starting to change and grow, but also because they're supporting each other and they're thinking about the collective, they're growing in the same direction. They're moving into a sort of a shared set of strategies and values to go forward. So
Yeah.
it can be very frustrating when one leader in a team wants to change dramatically and no one else does.
Mm.
And so again, coaching can help with that, but I think the combination of working one-on-one and as a group in
Yeah.
different sort of cadence can be really powerful as well.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, psychological safety would be absolutely critical before you can even go in and do the work.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we focus on three simple elements.
Hmm.
Trust. Do we actually trust each other? Not do we like each other? Because
Yeah,
there's plenty of people I like, but I don't trust. And there's people I trust that I don't necessarily like.
true. Yeah.
And when you're thinking about business, uh, my suggestion is focus
Mm.
on trust.
Yeah.
And the second is understanding. And this comes down to, do I know what you do?
Yeah.
Do I know, do you know what I do? And do we know how
Mm.
these pieces actually fit together? And why that's so important is often you'll see people make a decision which is good for their team,
Yeah.
but the flow on impacts are horrible for everyone else. And so I need
Yeah.
to understand that and have a comprehension of that. The third element is curiosity.
Yeah.
We need almost a unquenchable thirst to ask why, how can we do this differently, what else could go on. And the reason why that's so important now is the world outside is changing so fast
Yeah.
and is much more diverse and different than it's ever been. So if we don't have that curiosity and empathy to really keep
Mm.
challenging and asking questions, we're going to fail and die.
Yeah.
So with those three elements, we get much more innovation, much more agility,
Mm.
more challenging and open conversations. And really at the heart of that comes back to making sure that people trust, understand each
Yeah.
other, and are open to asking questions.
Yeah, love that. I did an episode recently with Connor O'Malley, who is a trust expert. He's got a book called Trust, and trust begins and ends with self, which is a really powerful message. And of course, when you talk about understanding, it's understanding self and understanding others as well, which is really important. Great stuff. Can you share that four-step process that you mentioned, Daniel?
Yeah, so the empathy process
Hmm.
is something I developed. So as I said, I wasn't necessarily the most empathetic person. I don't think my wife would probably agree with me. So I wanted to have a process that I could
Mm.
follow to get better. So the first step, which is sometimes the hardest, is what we call consciously curious.
Hmm.
So this is where I'm aware that I see someone or I hear someone or I see a situation. I have assumptions about it. Sometimes we talk about unconscious bias as something we need to eliminate or get rid of. I think we need to be aware of it. It's there, and
Mm.
we can't take all of the assumptions out of our brains. It doesn't work that way. So it's just firstly being aware that I have assumptions, and I'll probably use them unless I take conscious action.
Hmm.
So I tend to imagine that inside our heads are millions of little cards that have got these relationships and associations on them.
Yeah.
We've got one for a table, one for a chair, and one for a cafe, and how they all fit together is very complicated. What I want to do is say, okay, here is someone I want to understand. I have assumptions already, but to have real empathy, I'm going to take that card out, I'm going to put it aside, and I'm going to start with a blank piece of paper. I don't know anything, but I'm interested.
Hmm.
And that's a state we can move into momentarily. We can't live there, but we can start there. We need to do that because the second step of the process is openly exploring. This is where we sit and ask questions and try to really understand the experiences of another person, see what's going on here.
Hmm.
And obviously asking great questions. We spend a lot of time on how do you ask open questions. Not all questions are equal. We know that
Hmm.
are you really going to wear that isn't a question. It's a statement with a question mark at the end. So we want to ask good open exploratory
Yeah.
questions. How does that feel? What do you think about this? What else is going on for you here? And the reason why conscious curiosity is critical is because if I step into asking questions before I park my assumptions, what I tend to do is ask questions to validate my assumptions
Yeah.
instead of asking open questions to just explore.
Mm.
Once I've done that, I've sort of used this time to gather as much information as I can. I then want to pull back that little card that I had, those assumptions I had, take this new information and make any changes that I think need to be made. I can update and rewrite my mental models, my views of the world, and my assumptions based on new information. And the ability to do that is available to us all the time. We know that brains can change right through our lifetime. So That's what we call changing or challenging our models.
Mhm.
And then once we've done that, now leading with empathy is about making decisions based on this new understanding. Now, your decisions might not be favorable to everyone. Your decisions may be tough for some people to hear. They might not like them at all. But you've at least invested the time to consider and understand someone's perspective. And that's something that what we've seen time and time again is if someone tells you some terrible news, okay, we're restructuring, you're going to lose your job, and they've got no understanding of you, they've never communicated, they've never asked a question, people are rightfully upset by that.
Yeah.
But when they've been spoken to and consulted and talked to, they might still not like it, but they feel much more like they can accept what's going on. And more importantly, they can see you as a leader, as someone who actually did take the time to try and understand. The final little nuance in this model as we sort of cycle around is once we've got a new perspective, a new understanding, what we tend to do is tell other people that they need to update theirs and change their perspectives.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work very well. I mean, you see this on social media, people abhorrently screaming at each other through keyboards about why they're wrong and what they need to change. It does almost nothing to change people's minds. What we think about here is when you are a leader and you're leading with empathy, how do you inspire that conscious curiosity in others? How do we loop back around and take people on that journey for them to consider and then to be open and thoughtful about this? And so it sort of creates a nice sort of loop back into the system to say, as a leader, your job is not to build empathy and then tell everyone else to change. It's about building empathy and then inspiring others on that same path.
Excellent. I love the conscious curiosity.
Yeah, it's easy to say, very hard to do sometimes. And it takes time. It takes thoughtfulness. It takes having energy, not being tired, worn out. It's there's a lot in there.
And I would imagine, some of your clients will be similar to the type of leaders I work with, that this sort of work that they're doing on themselves can be very uncomfortable. How do you deal with that?
Look, I think every time we try and change, we tend to find it is uncomfortable, particularly the older we get. It's harder sometimes. It feels harder. The main thing we focus on is what are they trying to do? What's in it for them? And I think that's where most business leaders think of when they think of their staff or their clients. That, why would they want to change? And what we know is that as we develop more empathy, that leaders can make better decisions. They get better outcomes. I'll give you an example. We run a workshop around scenarios, and it's quite fun because you can almost gamify it a little bit. But we give a small group of people a scenario and then 3 sort of set options. Now, it's an ambiguous scenario, and the options, sometimes there isn't really a good one. There's sort of 3 bad options. And they've got to consider, well, what will we do? How will we what will we do going forward? Look, a good example of this that I can probably tell you quickly, Lisa, was an organization, and this is a real case study, but an organization was sending out letters to their customers about a credit card. There was bushfires in an area, and so there was a question of, what should we do? Do we keep sending the letters? They might not get there. They don't have homes. Or do we make phone calls to all of them? Do we call them all and make sure they're okay? Now, in this scenario, what we find is the groups very, very quickly say we should make calls is the right thing to do. Using empathy, though, we can say, okay, let's have empathy for our staff. Are our staff equipped to make these sorts of calls to sensitive customers who are vulnerable and in times of distress? And they start to think, maybe not. Okay. Do they have the time and capacity to even make these calls and sit on the phone for as long as it needs to get to a resolution? What about our customers? If your house had just burnt down, would you be you get a phone call from a number you don't know.
Mm.
The person says, "Hi, it's such as Bill from the bank. I just need your full name, date of birth, and address, please. I need to verify your identity."
Mm.
You're probably thinking, "Yeah, my house is burnt down. I've lost
Yeah.
family. Do I really want to talk to this person?"
Yeah.
And so, while at the very beginning the sense of the right thing to do
Mhm.
feels so compelling that we should call people, empathy actually gets us out of our assumptions in our heads
Mm.
and into the minds and lives of people who we're actually going to impact on. And
Yeah.
so it, while it's a soft skill and it is an intangible,
Yeah.
it has a great deal of strategic value in things like
Yeah.
decision making.
Absolutely. It's that, take your foot off the gas, hit the brakes, and just stop and think. Having that time, pausing, stopping and thinking, and don't feel like you've got to make the snap decision. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, what we saw is in these groups is people will jump onto something quickly.
Yeah.
They feel a bit of time pressure. Let's just go on. Let's move on. And the ability to execute isn't really thought of. And
Mm.
I'm not sure about your clients, but often great strategies are written everywhere. Great execution is where
Yeah.
things tend to struggle. So
Yeah.
we need
True.
to have that mindset.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. Fabulous work that you're doing, Daniel. And great to hear that you're doing well and you're getting into the organizations that need you most, which is fantastic. Now, if people want to find out more about you and the work that you do, your website.
Yeah, empathicconsulting.com. There's plenty of information there.
Mm.
There's lots of free articles and ebooks and blogs and all those sorts of things.
Brilliant. We'll put all that in the show notes. You're also on LinkedIn and across socials as well. So encourage people to reach out to Daniel and find out more about empathy. So Daniel, I like to finish each episode with the same two questions. It's the only part of the podcast that's scripted. So question one is, can you share a quote or mantra that you live by?
Oh, a quote or mantra I live by. Look, I think don't assume you understand what someone else is going through. There's lots of versions
Yeah.
of that that are sort of quoted around the place, but I think it's something I definitely live by, which is having spent
Yeah.
time in other countries, it's very easy to assume and pretty dangerous at times.
Yeah, take it as that taking a step in somebody else's shoes, which is the analogy that I like. Yeah, and a book that has changed your life in some way that you would recommend that others have a look at.
There's so many, and boiling it down to one is
Yeah,
really tough.
I
But
know.
I think Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel
Yes.
Kahneman and Amos Tversky's probably up there. It's they won the Nobel Prize in economics for their
Yep.
psychological work. And if I could throw in another, I know I'm
Mm.
probably not allowed to, but I
You
can do it
are.
anyway, Lisa.
Absolutely.
For any leaders, I think Tribal Leadership is a really
Yep.
great book. Several authors to that book, but it's one that really starts to unpack what's going on in those intangible areas of our organizations
Yeah.
and what we can do to start to move into a better direction.
Brilliant. We'll be popping the quotes, the books, all the information that you've mentioned in the show notes. And this is this time of year is it's the anniversary of the podcast. And since I started the podcast, I've bought over 50 books because every time somebody mentions a book that I haven't read or I want to reread, I go, yeah, I'm going to get that book. So I'll have to stop asking the questions because my Amazon account is it's getting quite pricey. But I love reading and particularly recommendations for books. So thank you so much for sharing. And before we head out of the call, is there anything else you would like to add or leave the listeners with?
Look, firstly, just a big congratulations to you for doing this podcast, for
Thank you.
getting through a full year. It's a great achievement, and I think it's a sign of your generosity to share that your wisdom and the wisdom of others with your audience. It's a really great achievement.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being my guest today, Daniel Murray.
Thank you.